All right, this hearing of the Committee on Agriculture to review the present, past, and future of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program will come to order. Please join me in a brief prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask you to be with us this morning, to grant us wisdom, discernment, and knowledge. Help us have an openness to all points of view as we consider this very important program, its impact on the lives of Americans. Dear Lord, please be with those men and women who protect our rights and freedoms around this world and their families. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. The hearing comes to order, and I want to welcome everybody. We've got witnesses coming. All right. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to today's hearing and thank them for taking the time to share their thoughts and answer our questions about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's the largest program under the committee's jurisdiction, and today's hearing marks the beginning of a top-to-bottom review of the program. We will conduct this review without preconceived notions and with a commitment to strengthening the program so it can serve as a tool to help individuals move up the economic ladder. SNAP has grown from a pilot program that served just 500,000 people in 1964 to a program that at its peak during the recession served more than 47 million Americans. Being post-recession and post-Farm Bill reauthorization, we're in a unique position of being able to conduct a proactive review of the SNAP program, ensuring the program is prepared to address current and future challenges. There are also a number of bipartisan reforms enacted in the Agricultural Act of 2014, including a new work pilot, which have not been fully implemented. Evaluating those important reforms will also be a part of our review. Another key aspect to be included in this review is the private social sector's services sector. From churches to not-for-profits and local food banks, they serve important partners in the delivery of critical food assistance in communities across this country. While the economy has changed and other welfare programs have adjusted to meet changing needs, it does not appear that SNAP has. We have seen the overall unemployment rate fall, yet the number of long-term unemployed remains high. The lengthy recovery following the 2009 recession has brought in a new group of healthy working-age recipients who in the past had not used SNAP. This is a new dynamic not previously experienced following other recessions when periods of unemployment were much shorter. Some programs have responded to the changing needs of its target population. We've watched this TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program, has moved increasingly towards services such as transportation and child care as compared to cash assistance in order to better support the needs of working parents. We can all agree that no one ought to go hungry in America, and SNAP is essential in protecting the most vulnerable citizens during tough times. For many, it's a vital lifeline to keeping food on the table. What we don't want is for this program to hold people back from achieving their potential. I believe there's a role for SNAP, but we need to have a complete, clear understanding of its mission and its purpose. I look forward to hearing our witnesses today as we explore where this program has been, where it is now, and what it could be for participants and taxpayers in the future. And yield out to the ranking member for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to be here today at the committee as we begin the renewal of the SNAP program. I think it's important that the committee learn as much as we can about programs under our jurisdiction, and that's why I'm supportive of the reviews the chairman plans to undertake in this Congress. I hope this will be an opportunity to get past the rhetoric on both sides and get a better understanding of how SNAP works, who the program serves, and what, if anything, can be done to make it better. And while I support this review, I hope the committee will focus on some of the things that I think are problematic and not some of the rhetoric that we have seen in the past. You know, some people in your leadership overplayed their hands and you lost the opportunity to reform that we could have done back in 2013. And it still is a problem for me that we have a system where some states where they're using under this categorical eligibility, they're using the TANF guidelines to determine who gets the benefits. And this, you know, the federal rules are 133%. But if your TANF is above that, that's what you use. So in my area, in Moorhead, Minnesota is 133%. That's what you have to meet to qualify. But in North Dakota, across the river, they're 200%. So you got people in the same communities basically being treated completely different. In Texas, it's 165%. In Arizona, it's 200%. You know, what sense does this make? Now, this was put in place because it's going to make it easier for the people to administer the program, supposedly. and I guess that's fine. But I just think one of the big problems of the system is that we treat people differently in different parts of the country, and I don't think it's right. And the other thing, everybody fixates on work requirements, And I was here when we did the work requirements, and I supported it back in TANF. But when we have looked at this in SNAP and when we've administered it, we've always put in waivers. And so you have whole parts of the country that there are no work requirements because they have waivers. And to be honest, those areas are going to have waivers forever, no matter what we do. Now what sense does that make? Now in my area, we have a company. The biggest problem I have in my area is I hear from everybody we can't find enough people to fill the jobs that we have. Every place. We have 2-3% unemployment. We have a company that's paying $16.50 an hour to start. They pay your full health care, 100%. They're advertising on television every day, and they still can't get enough workers to fill the jobs. They have 3,000 people working, And then we're going to jerry-rig the whole system because of work requirements. So I hope that whatever we end up doing with SNAP, first of all, I don't think we should do anything because we did the Farm Bill and it's a 5-year bill, and they had their chance and it didn't get done. But if we're going to look at anything, I think we have to look at how we treat people differently in different parts of the country. I just don't think it's right, and in the review, I hope we take a look at that. So look forward to hearing the testimony, and we'll see how all this goes.
Thank the gentleman. Chairman yields back. Chair requests that other members submit their opening statements for the record so that the witness may begin his testimony to ensure there's ample time for questions. I would like to welcome to our witness table today Dr. Doug Bresheroff, Professor of Public Policy, University of Maryland, College Park, Maryland, and Mr. Robert Greenstein, Director, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. Dr. Bresheroff, the microphone is yours, and begin when you're ready.
Chairman Conaway, Ranking Member Peterson, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about this very important topic. I'm a professor at Chairman Conaway mentioned at the University of Maryland, where I teach courses on poverty, alleviation, and program evaluation, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I conduct research on international competitiveness and comparative domestic policy. SNAP's a large and complicated program. Together with other safety net programs, civil rights advances, and economic growth, SNAP has eradicated income-related severe hunger and malnutrition among the poor that motivated its original creation. I was in Mississippi in 1967, and I saw starvation and malnutrition up close. As a civil rights worker in the Mississippi Delta, I literally carried young African-American children who were ill and malnourished into hospitals that otherwise would not treat them. We'd walk in and we'd say, if you don't accept this child, Marion Wright, her name was Marion Wright in those days, not Marion Wright Edelman, will be here tomorrow morning with a subpoena. So I saw that up close, and, parties have switched. Those were the days when the Democratic Party held great sway in the South, and it was the Southern leadership of the Congress that made it extremely difficult to get African Americans on welfare, and there was starvation. The role of the food stamp program was a way around that exclusion, and the major expansions, for example, occurred under President Nixon as well as Democratic congressmen. But that was then, and now is now. SNAP's basic framework is anchored in the past. As my testimony describes, and I think as Bob Greenstein's describes, SNAP is now America's major social welfare program, income supplementation program. His graphs and mine tell about the same story. It has played an important role in the last recession. This is a worthy role. I'll show you a few graphs in a minute. But I think what the story today is the role of the program has to change. We're not in 1967 Mississippi. We're in a program with a $70 billion price tag that is income support and should be treated as an income support program. Based on my research, there's a great need to modernize the program and to coordinate it with TANF, with unemployment insurance, with SSI, with SSDI, and as well the Earned Income Tax Credit. There are also small wrinkles that create, as Mr. Peterson said, oddities like eligibility at 200% of the poverty line in some states. We also have a major issue, in my opinion, the rule about household income essentially encourages cohabitors to not report that they are sharing a household, and it definitely discourages them from getting married. The moment they get married, if he has income or if she has income, the food stamp grows to zero. So we have a possibility of a marriage disincentive. We have a possibility of a work disincentive. My bottom line I'll get to in a minute, but let me draw your attention to Figure 1, which is on page 3 of my testimony, and I think I'm embarrassed I don't have overheads like Bob, but I only have 2 graphs. Figure 1, Bob has this as well, shows the growth in enrollment of TANF, or not growth in TANF, UI, disability, and SNAP. And I would draw your attention to a few things there. First, TANF caseloads have hardly grown since 2005, even in the face of massive economic disruption. And you can see the disruption in the figures for UI and unemployment. Unemployment, of course, went way up in the Great Recession. What happened instead? What filled in for the needs of people who are unemployed? And the answers, as you can see from the graph, are SNAP, and to a much lesser extent, but also a real extent, disability. What happened at the state level, it was just in everyone's interest to put people on SNAP and disability, as opposed to TANF. TANF, every additional person on TANF is a 100% state cost. I'll say that again, a 100% state cost. And every additional person you put on SNAP is a 100% federal cost. The temptation is too great. The need to fix these problems, in my opinion, is as great. Let me draw your attention to Figure 2. Again, Mr. Peterson talked about the apparent great need for entry-level employees. There's an argument in the field about how much programs like SNAP, UI, discourage people from looking for work, for being in work. We could spend weeks on this conversation. Let me say that in the U.S., this is a long-term trend. I picked out some numbers for my testimony. In 1970, 96% of low education whites and blacks, 96% were working. In 2012, it was 79%. For those whites and blacks without a high school diploma, the figure went from 89% to 70%. This is important not just because we worry about the well-being of people who are not working, but as President Obama has said, as his chairman of his economic advisors has said, to get this economy moving at full speed, we need a much higher percentage of the working age population working. And this graph you can see, even as unemployment has gone down, even as GDP has gone up, both labor force participation, the top line, and the more telling employment to population ratio have gone down, which is to say, historically we have a much smaller percentage of our population working. And that's sort of like fighting the vestiges of this recession with one hand behind our backs. Everyone from the president to the Washington Post to the New York Times identifies low labor force participation as a serious problem. Janet Yellen calls it hidden or shadow unemployment. I believe these issues are connected. It doesn't mean we throw everyone off SNAP, but it does mean that SNAP and other income or means-tested programs have to adjust to this new reality. Thank you very much, and I think if I'm looking at this time, I went over. My apologies.
Thank you. Mr. Greenstein?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me and for the opportunity to be here today. I've been working on this program for over 40 years and had the privilege at one point in the late 70s as serving as administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service. I think Doug and I agree that SNAP has played the central role in eliminating severe hunger and malnutrition in this country. This led former Senator Bob Dole to call SNAP the nation's most important social program advance since Social Security. And over the years, SNAP has taken advantage of modern technology and business practice to become more efficient and accurate. I don't know if my slides are up. Can I pause for a second? I thought the slides had been arranged.
Well, yeah, stop his clock.
What do I need to do? I'm sorry. No.
There we go.
There we go. Apologies. I'm sorry. I'm not too gifted technologically. SNAP's error rate is now at an all-time low. Fewer than 1% of benefits are issued to ineligible households. The benefits are relatively modest. They average about $1.40 per person per meal, and they're highly targeted. 92% of SNAP benefits go to families with monthly income below the poverty line. 57% go to families with income below half the poverty line. SNAP can help families bridge periods of temporary hardship until they get back on their feet. Between 2008 and 2012, half of all new entrants to SNAP left the program within 1 year, participated for no more than a year, and then left the program. SNAP also appears to have important long-term effects on children. A recent study found that children who had received SNAP had much higher high school graduation rates and better health, including less obesity in adulthood, than comparable low-income kids who didn't have SNAP. And women who had access to SNAP in childhood had higher earnings and lower rate of welfare receipt in adulthood. Now, SNAP participation and costs have grown in recent years. CBO and other analysts have found the biggest reason by far is the economy, but the next most important reason has been an increase in the share of eligible families, especially low-income working families who participate. In 2002, only 43% of eligible low-income working families participated. In 2012, 72% did. Congress and the Bush and Clinton administrations concluded that some aspects of SNAP were making it unnecessarily hard for working poor families to enroll. They concluded that if families leaving welfare for low-paid work lost their SNAP benefits at the same time and had difficulty feeding their families, that would be contrary to welfare reform goals. Most of the policy changes, for example, that Doug lists in his testimony that have been made since 2000 were made to better serve low-income working families. And as this chart indicates, SNAP has made big progress here. Look at this chart. The share of families who are on welfare has plummeted. The share who work has increased pretty dramatically. Now, this brings me to the biggest cause of SNAP's recent growth, the deep problems in the economy, from which we're only starting now to make substantial progress. Some people look at the growth in SNAP caseloads and wonder if they'll ever come down. But the best assessment is that as the economy recovery finally reaches ordinary families, caseloads and costs will drop significantly. That is CBO's assessment. Caseloads have dropped by about 1.5 million people over the last 18 months or so, and now stand at 46 million. CBO projects they will drop to below 33 million by the end of the decade. And when budget analysts, whether they're conservative or liberal, ask if federal programs are growing in ways that worsen the nation's fiscal challenges, they ask if program costs are rising as a share of the economy, growing as a share of GDP. CBO's projection for SNAP is that its costs will decline as a share of the economy as the recovery continues, and by 2020 be all of the way back to their 1995 cost level as a share of GDP. Finally, Does SNAP discourage people from working? The conclusion of a team of leading researchers who examined all of the research in the field is that SNAP does not pose significant work disincentives, and its effect on the amount that people work is small. And indeed, census data show that people who worked before enrolling in SNAP, 96% then work in the year after beginning to get SNAP benefits, which suggests that turning to SNAP does not lead people to cease working. SNAP's work requirements are stronger than is often realized. SNAP has the toughest work requirement of any federal program. People aged 18 to 50 who are not raising children are limited to 3 months on SNAP out of every 3 years, unless they're working at least half-time. Job search does not count. If you can't find a job, you are out after 3 months. Now, as Mr. Peterson alluded to, this requirement was suspended in much of the country while the economy is weak, but it's now coming back. At least 1 million such people will be removed from the program between now and the end of 2016. Now, that doesn't mean SNAP can't do better in helping people gain jobs. And the recent Farm Bill establishes demonstration projects from which we should learn how to do that more effectively. In conclusion, SNAP is a lifeline for millions of people. The program can be improved. But it's worth noting that when the Simpson-Bowles Commission and the Domenici-Revlin Deficit Reduction Task Force called for substantial budget cuts, they both excluded cuts in SNAP, given its strong track record in improving access to food and reducing poverty and hardship for millions of our less fortunate fellow Americans. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here again. The Chair would remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for members who were here at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of arrival. And I appreciate everybody's understanding for that. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Brezhnev, can you help me better understand how an anti-hunger program from the 60s became the primary income support program in the United States today? From your description of the past, it appears that SNAP has undergone incremental changes in order to get to this current position.
Yes, sir. I can, and part of it is laid out.
Yeah, Mike's not on, I don't think.
Excuse me. Yes, I can, and part of it is laid out in my testimony, and part of it was reflected in what Bob said as well. In the 1940s to the 1970s, African Americans were systematically excluded from welfare in large parts of the country. Partly it was the unfit home rule, part of it was man in the household rules and so forth. The result was, as we became a less agrarian society, the result was people left the land, and hunger, starvation grew. The response from the federal government was to step in and to provide a feeding program, and it built on the original food stamp program which we had created and then abandoned in the 1930s. That original program, designed as it was to get around the rules in the southern states, did a number of things that now come back, I think, to haunt us. One was it had a separate measure of income from welfare, AFDC in those days. The result was every dollar less in welfare generated between 30 and 40 cents more in food stamps. I was in New York State at the time. We had Nelson Rockefeller as our governor, a relatively liberal Republican. His first response to the passage of the universal food stamp program was to recommend a reduction in AFDC payments because those the state had to pay 50% for, whereas food stamps would be a 100% federal. So states like New York and California cut back their AFDC programs to rely more on their SNAP or food stamp programs, and it was the pure arithmetic. Then came welfare reform, And then, and under welfare reform, the states had a very large incentive to reduce their caseloads. Every dollar they saved, they kept. It was tempting, and I think I've read it, Bob's testimony. This is a problem in the way TANF was implemented, but I think totally expected. If you push someone off TANF because of a work requirement, and they can still get food stamps, and in those days food stamps, still get Medicaid, maybe still get housing, you've blunted the work requirement, but you've also created an alternate path to public assistance. And that's why some on the right call the new SNAP program Welfare 2.0, because it's grown to be a very large welfare-like program. I know this is a lengthy answer. My last part of this is, come the Great Recession, and states were extremely hesitant to move people on TANF, plus a substantial amount of unemployment in the recession was male-dominated. For the first 18 months, the majority of the people who lost jobs were men, married men. Those families, often two-earner households, wouldn't qualify for TANF anyway. But when his earnings went down, whether or not she was also working, if they had two children, there was a tendency for them to be eligible for SNAP. So SNAP went up when the UI benefits ran out. This is the interaction that on the left you say, hey, this is terrific. This is exactly what we want. And in Bob's testimony, he talks about it as a counter-cyclical program. It surely is. But we haven't fixed the wrinkles. And the wrinkles are no real work requirement, serious questions about the fairness of eligibility determinations, and serious questions about what to do in the future. This is a lengthy answer to say we now have a new welfare program. It's called SNAP. It still fills an important nutritional need for people at the very bottom of the income level. But at higher levels, it is income support, and we ought to treat it that way.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ranking members recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I know the answer to this, but I want to get it on the record. I don't know anybody that would design a system where one entity decides who qualifies and the other entity pays for it. That's a recipe for disaster, I think. So when we went through the debate on the Farm Bill, we made this change in LIHEAP. And at the time I said that I thought when it came down to it, the states would decide to go from paying $1 a year to $20 a year so they could still qualify people. And some of them did, but some of them actually didn't, So I guess the question is, if we made a change in SNAP, or if a change was made in SNAP that said, okay, anything above 133% of poverty, the state is going to pay 50%, and the federal will pay 50%. What do you think would happen? Both.
I think there are a couple of parts to the answer. You raised the issue of LIHEAP, and I think there's a remedy, but I don't think the remedy is having states pay 50% above 133%.
No, I'm just wondering what you think would happen if that.
Well, I think different states would make different decisions, and part of the whole essence of this program, going back to President Nixon, was that prior to President Nixon, each state set its own eligibility standards. We had some states eliminating working families when their incomes reached only 50% of the poverty line. Other states did it very differently. And I think there's real importance in having national eligibility standards. For example, it lessens the disparity between low-wage areas and high-wage areas. It's why SNAP benefits actually are disproportionately greater in rural areas and in southern states. On the LIHEAP issue, the issue there, in my view, is that LIHEAP is supposed to help families that have low-income families that have significant heating bills they otherwise have difficulty affording. And I think the remedy is within the LIHEAP program, which certainly is under the purview of Congress, not particularly this committee, but your fellow members. And LAHEAP could be modified to make clear that it is not to provide benefits to people who don't incur heating costs. There are a relatively small number of states that are doing what you suggested, but there still are a few. But that could be handled through appropriate targeting of the LAHEAP program. But I would caution on the other side. You know, you have...
I'm not advocating. I was just wondering.
Well, I want to give you a key example.
I'd like the other...
You have only 1 in 6 low-income families that is eligible for child care assistance gets it because we have limited funding in the programs for child care. So we have 2 families. One of them has income at 110% of the poverty line, and it gets a child care subsidy. The other has income at 138% of the poverty line, and it doesn't get a child care subsidy. It pays out of pocket so it can work. The second family may actually end up with less money for food than the first family. So I think the reason that some states have used categorical eligibility, when you look at who they've helped through categorical eligibility, 90% of the families are working families. The typical focus of those families is they pay more than half their income for either child care or rent and do not get a child care subsidy and do not get housing assistance. So I think we need to be careful in how we calibrate those eligibility standards.
Doctor?
If you believe that that business firm, if it could find people to hire, would strengthen the local economy, and I think I do, then you can understand why governors, conservative, liberal, Republicans, Democrats, when they look at their political imperative, it is to get their state economy, quote, going again. I think the answer to your question, sir, is that subject to the lessons from TANF implementation, the states would jump at the opportunity to try to raise the labor force participation of people on SNAP assistance. And they would do it not just by having a different amount. They would do it through job training. They would do it through job search. And as I say, subject to the lessons of TANF, which we should take to heart.
So they'd reduce the...
I was at a meeting of 20 state secretaries, and I said, why do you want to reform food stamps? You don't pay for it. And they said, we worry about the well-being of our states. They would jump at the chance. They would take the offer, many states would take the offer and experiment with it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chairman's time has expired. Mr. Thompson, Pennsylvania, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. Very, very helpful, very insightful on this important topic. I certainly like the concept of taking programs like SNAP and taking them from what we've traditionally called, and some have characterized them different ways, safety net programs, but making them into workforce development programs, which I think come with more hope and opportunity. And so my question for both of you, do we even know what works in terms of solid evidence-based research to help folks who are find themselves, families in low-income situations, low-income work, and help them work and earn more and leave poverty? And more specifically, does the current SNAP program do that?
Let me start, but I'll try to be brief so that Bob has some time. The history of job training in this country is very disappointing. In matchup after matchup under TANF and before that AFDC, job training versus job search never did better. That is to say, people who were asked to look for a job immediately tended to get a job much sooner, and there's an argument about whether they got better jobs or not than people who received job training. I think partly that's because the job training programs weren't given a full opportunity to do what they needed to do. The last Congress reauthorized, this Congress, I guess it is, anyway, reauthorized the Workforce Investment Act, now called Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act. And I think many people have a great deal of hope in that. There are also now very promising programs that try to direct unemployed or underemployed people into jobs that exist. Left and right seem to think that those those kinds of programs hold great promise. And I think the answer is that if we took the job training and education more seriously in SNAP, we'd see some progress.
I think there are several aspects to this. First, when we talk about helping people work, we want to think not only about current adults who are unemployed, but what's the trajectory for poor children? Are they going to grow up as part of the workforce or not? Now, here, there's growing evidence that in families that are very poor, children's brains are already behind by age 2, farther by age 5 before they start school, and that benefits such as SNAP help reduce that. So the evidence is pretty strong now that particularly for young children, having access to SNAP benefits increases the likelihood that they will have earnings in adulthood. In terms of the current adults, Doug mentioned that there isn't really a work requirement in SNAP. I would really have to disagree with that. As we noted, 3 months out of 3 years for single individuals. For families with kids, if they are sanctioned for not meeting a work requirement in TANF, the food stamp law, the 96 welfare law, explicitly says that states can then cut their SNAP benefits as well, and most states do. The data show we have 70 to 100,000 people on the households on the program where one or more members of the household have had their benefits taken away for not meeting a work requirement in another program. And that doesn't count the additional tens of thousands of households who've been removed from SNAP altogether for not meeting a requirement in another program. But the real issue, as you've said, is what do we do to help these people work? As Doug indicated, old research suggested that for those people who are the most employable, pushing them to search for a job can help. The difficulty is that many people on SNAP aren't that employable right now. They lack even a high school diploma in some cases. Generally, they lack more than a high school education. And old-style job training programs often weren't as effective. What we're now learning is that if we can do more vocational training, more training that's really tied to what the employers in the local area really need, we can get some more success. A problem, and this is a recommendation I'd like to make for this committee, a problem is that up until now, our main job training system, the Workforce Investment Act system, didn't serve SNAP recipients much at all. It served people who already were more skilled. Then it could show higher rates of placement. And local workforce boards didn't like serving most SNAP participants because they had too few skills to begin with. On a bipartisan basis, Congress reauthorized the Workforce Investment Act last year and said it should orient towards more disadvantaged workers with fewer skills, and it gave local boards the option to coordinate more with SNAP. So I would really urge this committee to work with the committee, I guess it's Education and Workforce, and to really do oversight. We really need this to become a reality. We have some billions of dollars in the workforce training system, and it was largely bypassing SNAP recipients. We have an opportunity with these reforms to have it start serving SNAP recipients and give them more job training, but we really need to make sure that gets implemented that way on the ground.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, first of all, paint a picture of SNAP so that we all are operating with a clear and jaundiced eye. First of all, these are the facts. 37% of all food stamp recipients are white people. 23% are African American. 10% are Hispanic. And this is according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The census data indicate that 900,000 veterans receive food stamps each month. And this figure is understated because the census data do not consider homeless veterans receiving SNAP benefits. I want to paint the picture as clearly as we can. Feed Our Vets, a nonprofit group that establishes food pantries for veterans, has estimated that nearly 3 million veterans and their families don't get enough food to eat each month. And finally, 45.3% of all of those who are on SNAP are children. That's 17 million children in the United States. 1 out of every 5 lived in households in this country that are food insecure. And so I want to ask you all a simple question. First of all, in view of the realistic image of the food problem in the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, why is this? And as we talk about the problems, I think we need to put a direct line on how we get to some solutions to address the need. So if each of you might just tell me what you feel is the number one abuse, because in a hearing we have to get to that as well. I want your feelings on that. Where do you feel there is any abuse? Where would that be? What's the number one abuse to the food stamp program? Mr. Greenfield?
Doug is suggesting I go first, which I'm happy to do.
We're just taking turns.
I would just note, Mr. Scott, your figure of 900,000 veterans getting assistance is the figure for any given month.
Yes.
And over the course of a year, 1.7 million veterans get SNAP assistance at some point over the course of the year.
And that's understated because the census data does not identify the homeless vets that are growing.
Yes, the homeless are not fully picked up. You're absolutely right in the census data. In terms of abuse, this is not atypical of other programs. We have some people in great need who, due to various issues in the program, complexities, whatever, still don't get served. And on the other side, even though the error rate is very, very low, it could be brought lower. In Section 4 of my testimony, I won't go into the technical issues here, we have some proposals for how the federal government could help states make greater use of wage matching as information technology advances. And this could have a double benefit. It could actually help both of the things I just mentioned. It could lower errors by enabling caseworkers in real time as they're doing eligibility determination to match into more income data and find if there's something questionable in what the recipient reported. By the same token, it would relieve recipients of having to go back and forth and keep bringing more documents and keep coming back to the office, sometimes taking time off from work where they lose wages to do it, because the greater wage matching would provide income information that they wouldn't need to ask people to bring the documents for. So I think it could help both ease a barrier to participation, particularly for some of the working poor. We still have a lot of eligible working poor families that don't get SNAP, and it could reduce the error rate at the same time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gibbs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Bosharoff, been studying your Figure 1 chart, been looking at that, and made the point about SNAP has become an income support and lack of coordination between different agencies. I see in the Senate Budget Committee they released a CRS memo that there's 80 separate welfare programs run by numerous different agencies. So when I look at your Figure 1 chart and you talk about cost shifting, obviously there's probably a lack of coordination. I think you said that. But then I'm also thinking, I see the UI and the unemployed persons dropped. TANF was dropped a little bit, but it was kind of flat. And SNAP in your chart increased, the numbers increased significantly. How much because of low-income jobs. People got work, but this economy's, a lot of hardworking people out there have been forced to part-time jobs and got low-income jobs. How much of that would be a factor, do you think? And then my follow-up question on that, because I don't really know, when a person does get a job and they go off unemployment and stuff, can food stamps be prorated then? Do they get different amounts? How much an adjustment would be?
If we had a few hours, as Bob's testimony said, one of the problems about understanding the food stamp program is the rules get pretty complicated. One thing about when people get more money, what becomes implicated is the certification rule, which is when a person has to report an increase in earnings and so forth. And if we had more time, I would go into why I think it's a mistake to let people stay on without reporting increases in income. That's the rule. It was established to save state efforts while the feds paid for benefits. But to go right to your question, no one really knows what leads a 50-year-old person, male or female, not to go back to work, not to look for work. And I think people who try to parse that out and say, well, it's because there aren't enough jobs, or maybe it's because he or she wants to take care of a relative. I don't know what the percentages are. And to answer the question about what I think is the biggest abuse, and it's related to your question, it is we don't have a system in place for SNAP that takes into account the human vicissitudes of you give me money, in return all I have to do is tell you I'm low income. That's a mistake. I think that's a mistake whether it's SNAP, TANF, disability, or whatever.
So you're saying the certification process is very flawed?
It's flawed because we saved government, state government's money by doing it less frequently. Part of Bob's presentation, the reason why I think and Bob may disagree, one reason why we have more accurate determinations is we've lowered the bar. We've lowered the bar, and I think that's part of it. But I do think the largest problem here is engaging this program in the life course needs of the recipients and not just treating it as a program that deals with hunger. That's important, but that's in the past.
Yes, go ahead.
Excuse me. As Doug said, I do disagree with his last comment. So what happened around 2000 on a bipartisan basis? Congress and a number of analysts looked at the program and found that the share of eligible working poor families who were participating was very low. And when they looked further, what they found was that states were so concerned about being charged with an error if somebody worked a couple of hours of overtime and they didn't have it immediately in the data, that states were requiring working poor families, not welfare families, but working poor families, to come back into the office every 90 days to provide all of their documents. It usually took 2 visits, an average of 5 hours. Most people in low-wage jobs, your employer doesn't pay you while you take 5 hours off from work. There was really a sense that if we were serious about work, and if people get paid low wages that still leave them in poverty, then we need to have a system that enables them to use the program. And the solution, which was a bipartisan solution every bit of the way, was that we would require people when their earnings went up and put them over the income limit to immediately report, but that we wouldn't bring them back every 90 days to go through every day that was lost to sick leave or every hour of overtime. And that was really the purpose of the change in the program, and I think it was a positive change.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time expired. Ms. Fudge for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your testimony today. Mr. Greenstein, one of the things that I must agree with you on is I sit on education as well, and you are absolutely correct that the WEA bill was written to discourage boards from actually trying to place those who are hard to place, whether they are low-skilled or low-income or live in high-poverty areas or have limited education. That is the way the bill is written, because the way that the rating process goes, they rate them by how many people they place. So clearly, they try to place those people who are easy to place. So I just wanted to reaffirm that. My first question is, I hear a lot that since the unemployment rate has gone down significantly, why has not SNAP gone down in a similar rate? And why is there a lag between those two things?
So CBO has noted for a number of years that when you come out of a recession, there normally is a significant lag of several years between when unemployment comes down and when poverty comes down, and accordingly when SNAP comes down. But in this recovery, this is particularly true for several reasons. The group of the unemployed who are most likely to be eligible and participate in SNAP are the long-term unemployed. People who have been out of work more than 6 months, still looking for a job, exhaust their assets. There are a couple of really stunning statistics here. In every recession from World War II through 2007, there never were more than 26% of the unemployed who were long-term unemployed. Today, 31% of the unemployed are long-term unemployed. They're more likely to be eligible. Here's an even more amazing statistic. You'll think this can't be right when I first say it. The number of unemployed who are not receiving unemployment benefits is larger today than at the bottom of the recession when the unemployment rate was 10%. At that point in time, we had about 14 million unemployed. 9 million got unemployment benefits, 5 million didn't. Today we have about 9 million unemployed, down from 14, but unemployment benefits have shrunk, and we have 6.9 million people, nearly 2 million more than at the bottom of the recession, not getting unemployment benefits. They have a higher rate of receipt. We also have the fact that wages have eroded, particularly for male workers in the bottom of the wage scale. And so a number of people who have left unemployment for low-wage jobs, maybe lower than they had before the recession, they're no longer unemployed, but they're still eligible for SNAP because their wages are low. So all of these are factors, and it's part of the reason that Ben Bernanke has said that the unemployment rate right now is not a very good measure by itself of the economy. It makes it look like we've recovered more than we really have.
If I could just add 10 seconds there, and that's all right.
10 seconds.
Yeah, that's why I think this program is just like unemployment. We ought to treat it that way.
Thank you. Mr. Greenstein, another question. I think that when people say they are discouraged from working because they receive SNAP, can you tell us how much people get on SNAP? I mean, I think that the amount is so small, it could not discourage anybody from wanting to work. What are those numbers?
Well, the average benefit is $1.42 per person per meal. Institute of Medicine study has raised questions actually about whether it's adequate. Many people run out of food stamp benefits, SNAP benefits, before the end of the month. But I also want to note that there has been academic research on this question of whether SNAP discourages people from working. I mentioned in my oral testimony that the leading academic research in the field finds there isn't a strong effect there. There also was testimony before the Senate Finance Committee a year or so ago from one of the nation's leading conservative economists, Robert Hall, who's at Stanford and at the Hoover Institution, and he said the data do not seem to support the view that the social safety net is discouraging labor force participation. Participation by those in low-income families has generally risen, not fallen. The group for whom we have the biggest concern about the decline in labor force participation are low-income, low-skilled single men. And they're the very people for whom we have the 3-month out of 3 year rule in the SNAP program.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Dr. Benechek for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got two different answers for I've been listening to these questions, and Mr. Beshara and Mr. Greenstein seem to contradict each other about the requirement to work. So could you explain to me, there's a waiver. I thought there was a waiver for the requirement to work in place now. So Mr. Beshara, could you give me a short answer to that, and then I'll go back over to Mr.
I think it's 30 states that have a waiver for the work requirement, 30, Bob, and that's for ABODs. and the requirement or...
So those 30 states have no requirement to work.
That's correct.
So then, Mr. Greenstein, you're telling me that that's not the case, that there's very strict requirements to work. That's what your testimony was, it seems to me.
Let me explain. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of SNAP. In 1996, this requirement...
So what I want to know is, Mr. Besheroff not telling me the truth? There's not a waiver in place, then, that the states do not require the work?
As I said in my testimony, there are waivers that have resulted from the high unemployment, and they are gradually expiring.
Are there 30 states that require waivers, then, for the...
I don't recall. It's about 30. It might be 25.
So then 30 states have no work requirement. Is that accurate?
No, that's not correct.
Well, how is it? Tell me exactly what the waiver means, then, if it's not a work requirement. I'm just trying to figure this out myself.
First off, the key point is the waiver is only with relationship to these single adults not raising children. Number two, these are not permanent waivers. They're time-limited waivers, and they are expiring. And by 2016, very few states, single digits, 1, 2, 3, will have any potential to have statewide waivers.
All right, I appreciate.
That's why 1 million people are going to be removed from the program as the waivers expire and the work requirement is reinstated.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. You agree with that clarification, Mr. Besheroff?
Yes, except I'm not sure whether the waivers won't be extended under whatever conditions.
I see. Okay. Well, then I want to go on. I want to go on, though, to another question, and that was the duplication. I mean, I'm just trying to figure this out. 80 separate programs run by a dozen agencies, according to the CRS, that the Senate Budget Committee. How do we better coordinate the aid to people that need aid? Mr. Besheroff, can you give me a moment of your time?
I'm your guest here. Let me say that part of the problem is on this Hill.
Well, how do we do it?
There are a number of committees that jealously guard their jurisdiction. I sat in on a housing hearing once where they wanted to increase the size of a Head Start program, but instead of putting the money in the Head Start budget, they created a separate program under housing for Head Start. Part of this happens through the committee process. Part of it happens, there have been attempts since Elliot Richardson was Secretary of HHS to integrate these programs. Those on the left fear, based on experience, that if you throw them into a block grant, if you throw them into one big program, the total spending will go down. Those on the right perhaps want the total spending to go down, but they argue that putting all that money in one program creates efficiencies that more than make up for whatever political loss all those separate programs have. That's the kind of question that goes to heaven. The fact is there is a tremendous amount of waste in these programs. They are often work at counter purposes.
Mr. Greenstein, do you have any comment? How do we make it more efficient? How do we eliminate 80 different programs and try to achieve a better result?
Well, a lot of the 80 programs are very small programs that only serve very, very small percentages of low-income families. When you
think we should eliminate those programs then?
Well, they may be very important for certain very particular groups, children with certain kinds of very serious service problems that need a particular service. There are a much smaller number of large programs. I think states are making progress using information technology and coordinating them better, but we can do more than that. For example, in the field of Medicaid and so forth, HHS has set up this federal data hub that brings together lots of databases for wage matching purposes to improve accuracy, but a lot of states don't have ready access to it for SNAP. They should. That was one of the recommendations in my testimony, is to better integrate things like access to databases for wage matching across.
I'm out of time, Mr. Greenstein.
Give us that expired.
Thank you.
Mr. McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Besheroff and Mr. Greenstein, for testifying today. Today's hearing is described as the start of a top-to-bottom review of SNAP, and I'm certainly a proponent of rigorous oversight of all programs. But I have to say at the beginning, I find it a little bit curious that we seem to be singling out SNAP for review, especially at a time when the most recent CBO projections show that SNAP caseloads and spending is moving in a downward direction. And CBO also says the payments to farmers could be nearly $5 billion more than was originally expected in the Farm Bill. I don't know why we're not beginning with the top-to-bottom review of that, but I appreciate you being here, and I hope if we're going to do a top-to-bottom review that we also at some point have a panel of beneficiaries, people who are on the program, who can testify firsthand what works and what doesn't work. And maybe we should also have someone from the FNS here as well, because they administer the program. I hope that this is not going to be an exercise in another attack against poor people, because I fear I've seen this movie before and I didn't like it the first time. But it is what it is. Mr. Besheroff, in your written testimony, you spend a good deal of time questioning the idea of whether food insecurity is a real problem in this country. Let me assure you it is. I've been to public schools in my district where kids fear snow days because they won't be fed if they go home. I've been to hospitals and talked to doctors who have treated senior citizens who don't have enough money for their prescriptions and their food and take their prescriptions on an empty stomach and end up in the emergency room. I've been to hospitals when I've been told by doctors and pediatricians that kids, end up being admitted for what we would call a common cold because their nutritional intake is so poor that their immune system is compromised. So I view this program as essential to making sure that people don't go hungry, and good nutrition is also essential for people to have a healthy life. 2/3 of SNAP recipients are not expected to work. I mean, they're children, they're senior citizens, and they're disabled. I don't know how tougher work requirements help them. That's the majority of people on the program. And I'd like to ask you both about eligibility determinations. It's tough to qualify for this program. This is not a slam dunk. If I want it, I've got it. It's pretty tough. And the other issue is the fact, it was raised by, I think, Mr. Gibbs. I mean, the discussion really needs to be on this cliff that people hit when people go back into the workforce and all of a sudden they lose their daycare benefits and they lose their food stamp allocation gets reduced. And then they find themselves in the same predicament that they were before, empty shelves. And so, yeah, the economy is improving, but we're leaving behind a lot of low and middle income workers. And let me just say about the waivers. Republican governors, as well as Democratic governors, did that. And I think they did it, not because we're trying to cheat the system, but they did it because they actually realized that without the waiver, that there would be many people who they represent who would be worse off, who would go hungry. And finally, Mr. Greenstein, you mentioned this in your testimony. We've had commissions in recent years, the Bowles-Simpson Commission. It's a bipartisan commission, chaired by, and then we had a bipartisan policy center, a task force chaired by Pete Domenici and Alice Rivlin. When I think of Ellen Simpson and Pete Domenici, I don't necessarily think of bleeding hearts. But in their recommendations, they recommend we don't touch this program. So I've said a few things here, but I'm happy to have you comment on.
Well, let me just make it quick because I know Bob wants to answer about that. If this is a feeding program, and if we're worried about food insecurity, instead of letting the eligibility and the income of the average recipient creep up, we would do something to reduce the upward creep and increase the benefits at the bottom. If it's $1.20 a meal, and that's not enough, there are two ways to fix that. One is raise the costs for everyone in the program. The second is...
I'm happy to work with you to increase the benefit because I think it's inadequate.
I'll see you anytime you want.
Something like only 1% of benefits go to households with gross incomes over about 130% of poverty. But I want to get back to the work requirement issue because there's been a lot of discussion of it. it should be understood that the 3-month provision we're all talking about as a work requirement really is not a work requirement. It is a time limit, 3 months out of 3 years. If it were a work requirement, we would say you have to search for a job. If you don't, you're out. Here's a workfare slot. If you don't take it, you're out.
Gentleman's time has expired. Rodney Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues for beginning to review and address this very important issue. And I think it's good to point out that 80% of the Farm Bill that we just reauthorized is the SNAP program. So I want to commend Chairman Conaway for starting with a review of programs in the Farm Bill that make up 80% of it. So I think it's a great start, and I'm glad this committee is working in a bipartisan way to do this today. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the waiver process, and Mr. Benishek, my colleague from Michigan, clarified some of these issues, and I'd like to actually begin by expanding on some of those questions. Mr. Greenstein, are all the waivers you're talking about, do they expire at the same time?
No, but I think a lot of them, I think the lion's share of them, if I remember correctly, and if this isn't correct, I'll get back to your office with more information. I think the lion's share of them expire at the end of 2015. Some expire earlier. But I do want to be very clear that the waiver is a waiver of the 3 months and you're out rule. When the rule was established on the House floor in '96, the author of it said, here's what we're saying. If you can't find a job in 3 months, we give you a workfare slot. And if you take it, your benefits continue. But 45 of the 50 states never created the workfare slot. So what it's turned into is if you can't find a job on your own in 3 months, you're out. I think that people should be offered a job slot. I think they should be allowed to search for a job, and if they show they've been diligently searching, they shouldn't be out after 3 months. So what some of the states with waivers have done is they've waived the 3-month limit, but they've required these people to search for jobs anyway. So if one is looking at this whole area, I think it may be worth looking at how the entire provision works, and I would recommend converting it from a time limit into a true work requirement.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Besheroff, Mr. Greenstein mentioned that he expected maybe 3 states to possibly still reapply. And you mentioned in your comments to Mr. Benishek that you would expect some of these states whose waivers may be expiring at whatever time they may expire may ask the federal government and the administration once again to approve another waiver. What metrics need to be met for the administration to actually approve these waivers?
That's a trick question, sir.
Well, thank you. I didn't know that.
Because many people think that the administration doesn't need a metric to issue a waiver. So I don't think I want to go there. I just want to make one point in relation to this work requirement and what happened in '96. The job slots would have been 50% state expenditure, right? The job slots would be, and it's an administrative cost. So what the offer was is, after 3 months, if you put a SNAP recipient into a job, we'll provide 50% of the cost. But if you leave that recipient either on SNAP or it goes off entirely, it's not a cost to you. So to me, the issue here to implement this is not the details of these provisions, but to get the incentives for the states right. If we want the states to provide nutritional education, if we want them to provide job training, then the formula has to incentivize them to do that in a situation where right now 100% of program costs are state costs, are federal costs. And that's a giant incentive to look for any reason to either keep people on SNAP or get them off and provide no services to them.
Let me clarify. There are very detailed federal rules and metrics on what does and doesn't qualify for a waiver. They were not set by the Obama administration. They've been in the same rules that were in place under the George W. Bush administration.
So it wasn't a trick question?
And I also want to clarify that when I said only maybe 3 states would meet them, that's on a statewide basis. There will continue to be individual areas, there could be Indian reservations or others where unemployment rates might still be 10 or 15%, isolated areas, even after the economy is better. So some individual localities states could still get a waiver for. But in terms of the statewide waivers that they've had in recent years, except for few, if any, states, those will end.
Well, I see that my time has expired, and my next question I'm not going to be able to ask till the next round.
Gentleman's time is expired. Ms. Delbini for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both of our witnesses for being with us today so we can talk about this very, very important issue and program. Mr. Greenstein, you mentioned in your testimony that we had in the Farm Bill an employment and training pilot program combined with our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that we call SNAP Employment and Training. This is a pilot that I introduced based on some work that we've done in Washington State on basic food employment and training that has been a very successful program in our state. In one study, less than half of the participants remained on government assistance 2 years after starting the program. We had 60% of those enrolled in the program were able to find employment afterwards. And I think if we're talking about helping people get back on their feet, this is a key goal. I wondered if you can talk a little bit more about how programs like this might be able to help save money in the long run by helping people get back to self-sufficiency, and also make sure that those enrolled in nutrition programs are given opportunities as well to get back into the workforce or to seek other job opportunities that help them to take care of themselves and their families.
I think these demonstration projects are quite important. We've had mixed records over the years in terms of other kinds of employment-related programs. I think, as one of your colleagues noted, I think Congressman Fudge, that too often training programs out across the country, not SNAP ones but others, have focused on the people who already had the most job experience and the most skills and were the easiest to place. Often they were people who would have found jobs on their own anyway, even without a training program, but the training program then got to check the box that someone went through their program and got into a slot. And what we really need to do better about is providing the skills for the people who have the least skills and the least education to enable them to get in and stay in the labor market. And a lot of the people who are on SNAP, who are unemployed, fall into that category. It's not as though we know here are the 2 or 3 cookie-cutter things to do. So the purpose of these demonstration projects is to test a wide variety of proposals, and my understanding is states have submitted
in fact, we had the Secretary of Agriculture here, and he said that at the beginning of March we would be hearing on some of the on what their decision was.
Yes, my understanding is they're about to announce very shortly the pilots. And I had one conversation with Secretary Vilsack a month or 2 ago in which I said that my recommendation was pick an array of projects. Pick some from very conservative states, not as conservative. Do a range so we can learn, test a variety of things. And he said back to me that that was exactly what he planned to do.
No, that's great. I want to get back to an issue we've been talking about, a few folks have brought up, and I know the Center wrote a recent paper highlighting that 1 million people will be coming off of SNAP by the end of 2016 due to fewer states being eligible for waivers and more individuals being subject to the time limit. Congress passed a provision that requires those who can work to find a job or enroll in a state training program or workforce program in order to receive more than 3 months of SNAP benefits. Unfortunately, Congress didn't require the states to offer an opportunity, as we've talked about, to participate in a job training or workforce program. Washington State is eligible for and is currently using the statewide waiver for fiscal year 2015. I'm an original co-sponsor of a piece of legislation called the SNAP Work Opportunity Act, and it was introduced this week. This bill would help prevent those 1 million Americans from losing eligibility by only letting the work requirement apply to those actually offered a job training or workfare opportunity. And I wanted to know what you think of a piece of legislation like that in terms of helping us address this issue and making sure that we really focus on our goal, which is helping people get back in the workforce.
I think legislation like that or of its ilk is extremely important because it does reflect the nature of the caseload now. But I want to emphasize what I've said before, because the states were ready before the SNAP pilots. They were ready to accept the requirement to do things if they got financial benefit.
But I want to let Mr. Greenstein also respond, just because I want to make sure.
Well, lady's time has expired, and to be respectful for the other members, there'll be a second round if you want to do that. So,
thank you.
Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here this morning. And Dr. Bestroff, if you would, I want to talk about what success looks like. What does it mean for a program to work? Are we talking about, what is the proper definition of a program working? Are we talking about short-run financial improvement of a situation for a recipient? Or are we taking a longer view? Are we looking at the ability of an individual to help themselves over the long term, or is it something else?
I think mostly the latter. My answer would be as follows, and I want to try to be brief so that Bob can say something as well, if he wants. My answer would have been different 10 years ago than it is today. 10 years ago, the American economy was a situation in which unemployment spells tended to be short. People tended to, if they lost a job, go out and find a job. As Bob mentioned, as my testimony mentions, we have something like 30% of the unemployed now have been unemployed for more than 6 months. We are facing international competition where our low-skilled workers, except for the ones in jobs that can't be moved abroad, are losing income. So suddenly, our safety net programs are being asked to do much more than they used to do. So I would say that a successful safety net program or a successful SNAP program balances the need to provide long-term support for those who look like they're going to be left behind with a friendly, a helpful, tougher nudge into the labor force. So the two have to go together. Please don't hear me saying benefits should stop, nothing should happen. But the other side of that is, as benefits continue, we have to nudge people, we have to prepare them for the labor force. A successful program, to me, does both of those things.
If I could add, as my testimony indicated, SNAP has become much, much, much less than it was, say, 20 years ago of a welfare supplement program. Doesn't really do much of that anymore, and much more of a work and wage supplement program. As Doug just mentioned, international competition, other factors, wages have eroded for low-skilled jobs. If you look at the data, I think something like 17% of male workers 20 years ago or so received an hourly wage that if you worked full-time year-round would not be enough to lift a family of four to the poverty line. Today, 24% of male workers get a wage that low. The minimum wage is much lower in purchasing power than it used to be. All of these things make SNAP more important for working poor families, for people working for low wages. It also means it used to be that if you left unemployment and you got a job, you wouldn't be on SNAP. But with lower wages, a number of people get a job and they still don't earn enough to make ends meet and they qualify for SNAP. So I think we also have to think about the program in the context of an economy that's changed due to international competition, all kinds of factors, globalization, whatever. We have a significantly larger share of people making lower wages and needing SNAP to help with their wages be able to feed their family and still pay the rent and so forth.
In general, would you think, Dr. Basharov, as a professor of public policy, that policymakers tend to be reactive versus proactive And if you agree with that statement, what would you advise to take a more proactive posture and bring that into the context of SNAP?
Well, I think this hearing is a good example of a proactive step. As a number of people have mentioned, reauthorization is far away, and thinking about this problem, this program now, is very important in my opinion. It's important both because of its current situation. I'm not sure I buy the CBO estimates. What I'm very worried about is the future bumps in our economy. You know, we are, when you look at what's keeping us afloat, it's the Fed and cheap money from abroad. It's not as if we are out of these woods at all. So proactive is being ready for the next bump and getting this program ready for the next bump in the economy, it seems to me, is extremely important. And that's not being reactive, it's being ready for the next tragedy that hits us.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time yields back. Ms. Plaskett for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. I first wanted to take a moment to talk about how important SNAP is and other programs in the food, social security, safety net for the people of where I live in the Virgin Islands. We all know that poverty in the 21st century is a shameful reality for our nation. And in the Virgin Islands, child poverty is heartbreaking. According to a report from Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands and Kids Count, 31% of children in the Virgin Islands live in poverty. And to further underscore this troubling statistics, Virgin Islands families are struggling with a very high cost of living, driven by many factors, including that much of our food is imported, and we have the highest price for electricity in the nation. And while thankfully the American economy is on the rebound and reports of job growth in this country are very good news, unemployment in the territories is over 13%. Mr. Chairman, Virgin Islanders are proud people, and for them they are willing and able and very much want to work. But good paying jobs or any jobs in that territory are scarce. So for many Virgin Islanders, SNAP is the lifeline that helps them put food on the table and ensures that children, as has been underscored here, who are the main recipients, children in school are not hungry and ready to learn. For too many of those children, that school meal is their only home. I know constituents and indeed friends and family that insist that their children go to school to eat that meal. And the mothers and fathers who have jobs but are so low-paying jobs go to homeless shelters for their lunch, because when those families come home, they're going to have a cup of tea and a piece of bread for dinner before they get back to school. So one of the things that I'm concerned about is we talk in this committee about the waivers, and it appears that people are hopeful that the waivers are ending. But my question is, what happens to those communities and those areas should that waiver occur, where there is persistent poverty and unemployment that's very high? If you would both answer that question, please.
Well, this connects to Congresswoman Delbenny's question, and is one of the reasons I would very much support the proposal that she mentioned. Under that proposal, people hitting that 3-month limit would be offered a work slot. Mm-hmm. Now, if they took it, their benefits would continue. But in the absence of that, we'll have people hitting the 3-month work slot who are searching for work. They're looking, but they can't find a slot, particularly if they don't have good work skills or they're in an area where the economy is weak. And they could then end up with no assistance at all. If you look, I should have mentioned this earlier, if you look at the population that is subject to the 3-month limit, their average income is 19% of the poverty line, $2,200 a year. These are some of the poorest people in the country. Many of them have problems. A number of them are on the verge of homelessness. They're not exactly the best organized, most skilled, most able group. So I really do think we ought to be allowing them to search diligently for a job. In most other areas, that's part of a work requirement. And if they can't find a job, we ought to be offering them a work slot. I do worry about the hardship that will entail for people who are willing to work and are willing to look, but who can't find a job and are not offered a work slot and then have their food assistance cut off. And some share of the million people who will be cut off will be in that condition.
Thank you. Mr. Besheroff, I know you mentioned we're no longer in the poverty of Mississippi, the great state of Mississippi, and has a much lower poverty rate than the Virgin Islands. Could you speak to the waiver being removed and what happens to these families?
Well, I think the problem goes deeper than the waiver. About 5 years ago, I wrote a book about WIC. And I said we live in a world in which, at the time, if I remember correctly, 55% of all newborns receive WIC benefits. And I went through an argument that that was too high. We can quibble about what the number should be. But we said, don't just reduce the eligibility rules so that fewer children receive WIC benefits, and don't cut the program, but use that money to bolster the spending at the bottom. What you described are the people at the bottom who need extra help, and we made this point before. And my view, is that too many people at higher incomes are getting benefits. We ought to look at that, have a political argument. One side will win, one side will lose, but we ought to, when we do that, keep in mind that at the bottom, people may need bigger, higher benefits.
Thank you.
The lady's time has expired. I would like for the record to reflect that the waiver relates to adults, able-bodied adults with no dependents under 50. So families aren't caught up in the waiver issue, and it's just for the clarify that. Ms. Diane, you have 5 minutes to Jackie Walorski, the chairman, the subcommittee chairman for nutrition. Jackie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I appreciate you both being here. I appreciate your expertise and your lifelong endeavor to figure this program out and how to take care of our. It's on. Microphone's on. I appreciate your expertise in looking at this process. I think the validity of this conversation has already actually happened today because of the fact that we're hearing issues that are real and things that have to be looked at. And I appreciate the opportunity to look at this over the next couple of years as this Congress continues to roll out on how do we make sure that we don't have hungry, our fellow Americans are not hungry. How do we ensure that? And what does this program do? And I look at it, I've been involved in international feeding programs. My husband and I lived in Eastern Europe for 4 years, and we worked in the sewers with kids below ground that were trying, escaped from dictator communism. And we found hunger there, saw it, actively did something about it, found hunger in my district, in the 2nd District of Indiana, devastating populations of people that are trying to make this work. And I guess as we've talked about today, we've talked about the issue of how do families, how do single moms, and how do underemployed families pay for food and health care and lodging and daycare? How does all this happen? And my question is, when they finally get to a point where they have figured all this out, what then does the government do to really help these families? Is the SNAP program historically been just a Band-Aid to pass them on to the next somebody else to deal with them? Or is there a sense that, there's an opportunity to actually look at what this government can do, should do, and actually getting real help to the financial challenges and how this happened to begin with? So I guess just historically, where do you see this? Has this always just been a Band-Aid to try to get people along, or is there a long-term solution that's been talked about?
Well, I think the world's changed. Before 1996, we would have had this conversation about TANF. And what happened was when the Congress reformed TANF and the caseloads went way down, the SNAP caseloads over time, over a 20-year period, went up. And as I said in my testimony, some people, on the right especially, call SNAP Welfare 2.0, this is the new version of that. The difference is that within the SNAP program, the states don't have an incentive to really reform, to provide those kinds of uplifting services because of the formula. The formula is if a state wants to provide services to people in your district in Indiana, it has to pay 50% of the cost. But if it wants to just give out SNAP benefits, it only pays the administrative costs, and those are very low. So my recommendation is that you get whatever it is, whatever the incentive is, whether it's giving the states a bounty every time they get somebody from SNAP a job or an advanced degree or whatever, give them a financial incentive to help the people on SNAP. It's not there now.
Is there any sense of stewardship on the government's from the government's perspective once somebody is on SNAP? This issue of trying to figure out what keeps them from recurring, what keeps them from getting back on. In the government sense, is there anything that actually looks to ever really help these families stay out of? Do states check on them? Do social workers check on these people? Is there a validity that somebody really cares about what happens to these people? Or is this just simply, we've declared the program worked if they just are no longer a beneficiary?
That's a tough question to answer. I think it depends on the state, it depends on the governor, and it depends on the timing. Many governors, Republicans and Democrats, want to address these long-term problems.
Do we mandate, does the federal government mandate, have we ever mandated that somebody seriously track these families and see what's working, what's not working?
In ways, in myriad ways, the problem, when we as a collective impose those rules on the states, suddenly all we've done to the governor and the secretary of health or whatever, or food stamps or welfare, is his or her job then is, have I met the federal mandates? Have I met the federal mandates? And and so what we have is we have some members.
Real quick to Mr. Greenstein.
Go ahead.
Could I quickly note?
Yeah.
There are very different kinds of people on SNAP. If you look at the people who got on between 2008 and 2012, a quarter were off within 4 months, 52% off within a year, 67% off within 24 months. A lot of people don't need other help. They're on for a temporary period. Other people, their problem is just their wages are low, and they need a supplement. There's a smaller group that needs more substantial.
I appreciate it. I look forward to the continued dialogue. Right. I think it's very, very good that we're having the conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair Lake's time has expired. Mr. Aguilar, California, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenstein, expanding the discussion to food insecurity, which is related to this topic, of course, I was interested to note the University of Minnesota School of Public Health had a study last year that said 27% of veterans who came back from Iran and Afghanistan are subject to food insecurity. How will possible cuts in benefits affect these men and women who have already helped out this country tremendously?
Well, in general, cutting benefits would tend to increase food insecurity, not on a one-to-one basis, but in general, our situation, both Doug and I alluded to this in our testimony, you compare where we are today in terms of hunger, serious malnutrition, the most serious aspects of food insecurity to where we were in the late 60s before we had a nationwide SNAP program, and it's really like night and day. We still have significant food insecurity, not of the most severe kind we used to have, but still of some concern. And if we reduce benefits, we'll go backwards in that regard, in my assessment.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bashar, Mr. Greenstein's testimony pointed out something to me, and it reminded me that the three kind of bipartisan groups, Simpson-Bowles, the Bipartisan Policy Council, and the more informal Senate Gang of Six, they all shielded SNAP from reductions. If there's additional savings to be achieved within tightening work requirements or changing eligibility, why didn't these groups make a point to highlight that within their proposals?
Well, I can't speak for the groups. I can tell you that there's something quite insidious about the CBO scoring rules that affect some of this, which is many analysts, not all, but many analysts believe that work requirements, job search, and so forth will reduce the rolls. CBO scores that as a net cost, which is to say, there was a bill proposed by some Republicans, I think, 2 years ago, and the result was CBO said this is going to cost money, not less. Now, I don't know about what the commissions did. They were taking on so many big ticket items. They may have decided this one shouldn't be taken on. They may have decided that this program did so many good things that it shouldn't be touched at all. My view is it's grown tremendously in the last few years, and now it should be treated as an income support program, and all the issues that we've seen should be applied, because we would find, I think, that many of the changes would benefit recipients. Not all, but many would benefit recipients.
Mr. Greenstein, would you care to comment?
I was able to talk to a number of the people involved in all of this, including, I talked on a number of occasions to Erskine Bowles, to Alan Simpson, to people involved in Domenici Rivlin, and to the senators of both parties of the Gang of Six, and they made a specific determination. The deficit reduction should not increase poverty or hardship. And they weren't saying that there were no improvements that could be made in these programs, but they were saying that they did not think reducing benefits in these programs was an appropriate source of deficit reduction.
Thank you, sir. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Allen for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Yes, Rick Allen, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today. And I've been in Congress now for this is my 7th week. And I ran on the basis that Washington was too big, and it really did too much, and it really impeded the private sector from growing, which creates jobs and makes folks independent. I do think the SNAP program is essential to feed families, but I also know that somehow, it needs to prime the pump and not be the pump. And so I was interested in some of the comments about families moving in and out of this program. Dr. Bashar, as far as the states are concerned, do states fund what works, and what have the states been doing to focus programs and spending on what works?
Well, the Obama administration has led an effort to talk about what works and evidence-based programs. Many states have made a commitment to try to implement and fund programs that have shown some sign of success. In this program, they've been somewhat stymied, as I've mentioned, because of the funding rules. But I was quite impressed when I did meet with these 20 state commissioners outside of the SNAP process, using the WIA authorities that they did have, using other programmatic authorities. There's a great deal of experimentation already in terms of job training for SNAP participants and so forth. The problem is these are all small demonstration programs. Not a one of them is statewide. Not a one of them is funded at the level that the state officials might like to see. And that's because, as you point out, they're constrained by the federal rules. Their first priority is to fulfill the federal requirements.
Okay. So what you're saying here is that for the programs to be properly evaluated to see what works, the states are restricted actually by the federal government to make sure that happens?
Well, they're partly restricted, but it's much more a fact that the incentive structure just doesn't encourage them. You go to the governor and you say, look, I have this terrific program, I think it might work, it's going to cost us $5 million.
I see.
And then the governor asks, what happens if it works? Do we gain? Well, we gain some jobs. Do we gain because SNAP caseloads go down? No, sir. And I think we have to incentivize the states in a responsible way to benefit when they provide services to SNAP recipients.
As far as the evaluation process goes, why aren't all programs in SNAP vigorously evaluated? I mean, folks that move in and out of the process, how do they get off of SNAP, what works, what doesn't work, and because, right now, we're at an all-time high as far as folks receiving SNAP benefits. And the objective is to get these folks good jobs where they're not using this and can actually fund their own nutrition. But how do we vigorously come up with something that will work to get folks off the program?
Yeah. Well, sure.
At the present time, we actually don't have good information, good data, good evaluation on here are a series of employment-related programs that work for SNAP participants. That's the purpose of the $200 million, I think it is, that has been provided in the 2013 Farm Bill for demonstration projects in up to 10 states with rigorous evaluation. And if, as a result of that, we really learn some things that really work, then we ought to think about how we fund them. We may want to look at some of the incentive issues, as Doug has referred to. It's not as though we know right now, here are the 5 things to do, just do them. But that's the purpose of that demo, and I think that demonstration project could prove important.
Are we spending that money to get to the source of the problem, though? In other words, we're spending a lot of money. As you said, some money has been appropriated to evaluate the programs. Are we getting are we getting a bang for our buck out of that evaluation process, or is it?
Well, it hasn't started yet. It's just about to start.
Okay, all right. Well, I apologize for that.
Well, I would also add that record keeping, data systems, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, HHS, are very weak. And those of us who know about them worry about the quality of the data.
Yeah, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Kirkpatrick for 5 minutes.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. And the problems you describe are descriptive of many people in my large, sprawling, rural Arizona district. And I want to point out, for example, a recent study from Johns Hopkins regarding food insecurity on the Navajo Nation. And some of the statistics are just staggering. For instance, unemployment is over 50%. 76.7% of the households suffer food insecurity, and 82% of the population is overweight or obese. So SNAP is essential to these folks, and my question really is twofold, and I'd like both of you to address it. The first is, how does the fact that 1 million people are going to be leaving SNAP affect tribal and rural communities? And it's interesting that the USDA does not release numbers on hunger among American Indians. So my first question is, how is that fact of 1 million people leaving going to affect tribal communities? And secondly, this is a difficult problem. We've been dealing with it for years. So I like to look to innovation as a possible way to move this so that it'll be more effective and more efficient. And I'd like to know your top 3 innovative ideas if you were going to make the SNAP program more effective and more efficient.
I worked for the New York State Legislature, and the Speaker got this briefing about how we should run the State Assembly. And the wall of steps. And the first step was this light bulb that lit up. And the idea was someone had a bright idea. I would take the view that there are loads of bright ideas. A couple of them are in this town. But most of them are out there. People trying to deal with the problems. And I think probably, I don't want to go too far, the problems in the Virgin Islands are a little different from the problems on a Navajo reservation. Some similarities, some not. When we constrain decision-making as much as we do, we remove the ability of local people to come up with bright ideas. Now, at the other end of this, when we give too much discretion, they go running in whatever way they go. So I don't want to leave it as the answer is give everybody, a free rein here. But the more we constrain in Washington, the less ability there is on an Indian reservation. And I don't know why USDA does or doesn't count, whatever it does. But ask me if I'm surprised. And the answer is, of course not. Right? So my bright idea is let a lot of people have bright ideas. Give them the wherewithal to persuade local communities, and then provide the sort of supervision that we really didn't provide in TANF to make sure that it's done responsibly.
I would have a couple of thoughts with regard to the first part of your question about people coming off the program. To me, the reservation you cited is an example of why the right policy should be to have a work program slot or a job training slot for these people. If we don't, because whether it's the reservation, the federal government, the resources are not provided for that, then in an area as overwhelmingly poor as you've described, I think that's the kind of place that ought to be allowed to continue to have a waiver. Otherwise, ending the waiver isn't going to give people a job. It's going to create a lot of hardship. Having said that, we ought to be doing better on the job training front. We ought to look at how, with the Workforce Investment Act improvements, can that lead to better service in a reservation? The job training demos could be important there as well. I'd also note that we're making some progress in improving coordination across programs, using, for example, SNAP data to make sure that poor children don't fall through the cracks in terms of school lunches and breakfasts. I think there's a potential for further progress there. And finally, this area is the kind of place I worry about when we ask the question, coming off of the recent, maybe a year or two ago, Institute of Medicine study, there's a question as to whether the underlying level of SNAP benefits is adequate for people at the very bottom. Yeah. We do have evidence that about 80% of the benefits are used in the first half of the month. A lot of reports of people running out before the end of the month. In an area where there's no other jobs and no other income, that's a concern.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I yield back.
So, ladies, time has expired. Mr. Rouser, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming before the committee today. I'm going to ask you a question that if I've gotten it once, I've gotten it a million times back home. I represent southeastern North Carolina. I have a lot of families that work 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. During the course of the Great Recession, a number of them lost a couple of those jobs, were working one, doing whatever they could. And so they go to try to get help, and they can't get any. And then they get in the grocery store line, and they see other folks who have food stamp benefits and everything else, and they know for a fact that they've not paid near the amount of taxes or anything that these families have over a long period of time. And so the question is, how do we get our incentives right? How do we, and I go back to this basic principle, you get more what you subsidize and less of what you tax. In fact, on the tax side of things, that principle is riddled all throughout the tax code. You have tax credits for this and that and deductions, et cetera, for all those things that Congress, wants to encourage people to do. Well, on this side, on the benefits side of things, it just strikes me that perhaps, and this is the difficulty I recognize, and we all want to take care of those who need the help. But when I have folks back home who are telling me they're in dire straits, they paid their taxes, done everything right all these years, and they're not eligible for anything, and then they contrast that with those who have not contributed quite as much to society, let's say, and they're getting everything. That's a real problem, and that issue surfaces all the time, particularly the past 4 to 5 years in particular. So how do we get our incentives right? We've been kind of all around this, and I'm asking more of a broader question, perhaps maybe a little bit more of a philosophical question. But I think we got to start thinking about this from a different angle. Do we need to have a program, in essence, where we come in and say, all right, if you have a job, here's a payment because you're doing the right thing? I just throw that out as an idea. There's abuses with everything that you propose, obviously. But I'm just curious, how can we think about this from a very different angle? Because clearly what we have in place, at least from my constituent standpoint, is not working.
You ask a giantly important question, and I'm going to punt. The first way is that we recognize these incentives exist and that they're real. The year after I was in Mississippi, I was a trial lawyer, and we were in court and taking a child away from a mother because she had been abusive in giving the child to the grandmother. And the grandmother was sitting on the witness stand. And I watched her recalculate her AFDC benefit in her head. So these benefit structures are, they may be difficult for us to understand, but for a lot of the people, they're not, this is their livelihood, they understand. So first step, I think, is to understand that these incentives exist. Secondly, some of these incentives are embedded in the way we live. I mentioned briefly about cohabiting couples. This is a giant problem. We have a program on this. It's wonderful for a professor because there's no good answer. If you say that people who cohabit should be treated as an economic unit, and that's the formal law, but I don't think that the data suggests that that's not how it works, because they have to technically share money. If you say that they have to be, that they have to share, they're going to lie to us. And to enforce it, we're going to have to do the old man in the house rule. We have to go to the house and see who's living there. If we say, well, until you marry, it doesn't count, which is, I think, the informal rule now, then we've really created a big disincentive to marry. Without knowing a great deal about the situations you described, I'm willing to bet one of the reasons what they're seeing there is family structure, which is to say if there are two parents in the house and one of them is working, depending on the situation, they're unlikely to be eligible for food stamps. So maybe your advice is tell him he should leave the house, pick up the food stamps, and then ask him to come back. These are there. They're real. They're not easy answers, but unless we look to see how to handle these questions, we'll never find answers. And I think that's important. I think it's giantly important because we want to protect the people at the bottom. But as this program has reached more and more people with somewhat higher earnings, we have to fix these incentives, and I think pronto.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Adams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. My district in North Carolina includes both Charlotte and Greensboro, two of the more larger cities. So my being on this committee, I have a concern and want to make sure that both the adults and children in my district will continue to have access to SNAP if they need it. Because there's a survey that showed that both Mecklenburg County and Guilford County are two of the top counties for SNAP recipients in North Carolina. No studies have shown a causal link between SNAP benefits and obesity. Any oversight of SNAP must recognize, I believe, that it's already helping families eat more healthy foods. So my question, Mr. Greenstein, one of your organization's publications cites Food and Nutrition Services to report on trends in SNAP participation rates. It's estimated that 1.4 million eligible children were missing out on benefits. So as we implement this 2014 Farm Bill, what are the largest barriers to ensuring that children eligible for SNAP are actually receiving the benefits? Mr. Greenstein.
Well, we have some issues, I think, particularly in families that are disconnected in various ways. The parents may have health issues, mental health issues, other issues, and the family may be eligible but doesn't get signed up. I think there are a few issues here. One is the bulk of eligible children who aren't enrolled are actually children in working poor families. That's still where the largest share, I think, of eligible poor families with children who aren't enrolled fall. Information can help. I also think this is an area where we can both improve participation and reduce administrative costs by better coordinating the eligibility and intake and verification systems across different programs. We've made progress, but we still have situations where families go to one office and apply for SNAP. A month or two later, they go to another office to apply for Medicaid. They're asked for the same information. And to the degree that we can use information technology to coordinate this, we'll get more accuracy and fewer errors. Will reduce barriers to participation. Working families will have to spend less time off for work and more will participate. And we'll have more accuracy and lower administrative costs at the same time. So I think that's an important area to try to do more of. Last point is, some of these are situations, this is very common in all of these programs, where people go off the program when their certification ends. For whatever reason, they didn't understand they had to reapply, or they got caught in red tape. And then a few months go by until they get back through the red tape and they get back on the program. So again, using information technology, information from other programs to try to coordinate better can also reduce this churning off and on and off of the program. If a family is eligible, like because the parent makes very low wages, we would want the children to be able to not experience these multiple months of breaks of assistance.
Okay. The thrifty food plan that USDA uses to calculate the cost of a nutritious yet low-cost diet, the overall formula is adjusted for inflation. The price of foods in the thrifty food plan have not been updated since 2006. So how much of a gap still exists between a household receiving the maximum level of benefits and the average monthly cost of purchasing healthy foods?
Well, there are a couple of issues here. So the SNAP benefits for any fiscal year, October through the next September, are based on the cost of the thrifty food plan, the lowest cost bare bones diet the Agriculture Department has developed. It's based on the cost of that plan the previous June. So it's actually 3 months out of date when the benefit starts, the fiscal year starts, and 15 months out of date when it ends. For that reason, there was a significant period of time where the law, as passed by this committee and the counterpart in the Senate, was that the benefits would be tied to 103% of the cost of the thrifty food plan, the idea being 103% of the previous June from the previous fiscal year would equal about 100% on average in the current year. But that was ended as a budget savings in the 90s.
Gentleman's time, lady's time expired. Dr. Yoho, 5 minutes.
Excuse me. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you having this timely meeting and bringing this up, with the nutritional program accounting for 80% of the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill roughly $800 billion over the next 5 years. I think it is timely, and I think this is the best one to bring up since it is the most money spent. And I appreciate you guys being here in the fact that I see you a little bit on different sides, which is good because we get that feedback. And that's what we're going to need to fix this problem. And this is something I think we want everybody off of this program eventually. I mean, in an idealistic world, but we know that's not going to happen. And I'm sure with a lot of the government programs, you see a third of the people just are taking advantage of it, or, a percentage, I won't say a third. And then there's another percentage that are working the system. And then there's that that group that it was intended for, the very people, the elderly, the children, the people with disabilities. That's what we really need to reform this program. And I don't know anybody on either side that doesn't want to do that. But yet when you get these big government programs and you have roughly 12 different agencies working to solve this problem, it gets kind of muddled. And being a veterinarian for the last 30 years in my training, we looked at the whole system. What I see here is we're dealing with, nutritionally deprived or undernutrition individuals. That's a symptom. The underlying problem, and Mr. Scott brought this up, is poverty. Why is there poverty in the United States of America? The freest country in the world with the most opportunity, and we're talking about poverty. And we've had a war, we waged it for the last 50 years, spent over $20 trillion, and we're getting more people on that. And Dr. Basharoff, you brought up the point that until we deal with our underlying problems, we're going to continue this. You know, our money is being devalued. We're at $18 trillion in debt. We've got Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid that are just consuming us along with our interest and retirement programs. And until we turn the tide and bring value back to our dollar, this is going to go up because people are going down as far as quality of life. And so saying that, I wanted to ask you, and I assume you guys are going to be available for input from here until we get this resolved. And I think success should be measured by retiring a program. You know, I don't know if the federal government ever does that, but wouldn't it be, I know it's ideological, to be able to retire it to a point where it's 30% of the farm bill because we got people out of poverty. And so you were talking about the federal government providing so many different levels of support, and we create a disconnect between the local governments, maybe the faith-based organizations, and state government. And I think I would like to hear your opinion. Do we get to a point where the federal government steps in and says, we're going to handle this, and so it takes the onus or the pressure off the states to say, hey, it's the federal government's problem? What's your thought on that, Dr. Besheroff?
I think that's the big challenge. We are a continental country, 340 million people, blah, blah. And to think that you can run these programs from Washington is to inhale, frankly. And yet, the other half of this is it's federal tax money. And so there's got to be a balance that's drawn. I don't think the Congress nor the administrations, the last 4 or 5 of them, have thought through this problem hard enough. They haven't given us a way to think in the modern world about the distribution of authority. So I have this terrific job. I study what other countries do. And I hate to tell you this, that means I have to go visit them. And that's a lot of fun. And many countries are smaller than our, Europe altogether is larger than us, but every country is smaller. But what they're doing in Europe, what they're experimenting with in China, is devolving more and more authority to the local level and attaching it to accountability. We haven't done that modernization of federal programming nearly as much as I think we could.
I look forward to having you come in at some point. We can talk, and I'd like to get Mr. Greenstein's comments on that.
Well, the core of your question is, what do we do to dramatically reduce poverty in the country so there isn't the need that we have today for the SNAP program? And that's a really big question. You know, if you compare the United States to Western Europe, when you look at levels of poverty just based on market income, employment and wages, we're about in the middle. When you look at levels of poverty after taxes and government benefits, we have one of the highest poverty rates because we actually do less than those other countries do. The answer is, how do we get to full employment? Have we got the unemployment rate back to 4%?
I would love to talk to you more, but I'm out of time, and I appreciate it, Mr.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Ashford for 5 minutes. Brad, why don't you move to the microphone right beside you?
Works. So anyway, I want to thank you for this hearing. I spent a number of years as chair of a committee in the Nebraska unicameral legislature, and I always got to talk first and for long periods of time. So this is really good for me to be able to learn patience at this ripe old age of 65 or whatever I am. But in any event, this is incredibly important to me, and I thank the chair for having the hearing. I also appreciate Mr. McGovern's comments about the need for these programs, and the fact that we're talking about them is not a reason to cut them unnecessarily or make them go away without a good reason. And I also appreciate the comments regarding Simpson Bowles. I think it's absolutely right. I mean, is a very thoughtful study of our deficits and how we get to a balanced budget and how we proceed forward, and that we should not be putting people into poverty as a part of that process. And I think that's very important. Very briefly, I spent in the early 90s when I was in the legislature, I sponsored the first welfare reform bill in Nebraska in 1994. We had a waiver. We did welfare reform in Nebraska in 94, 2 years before the federal law. And then I served a number of years as chair of our, actually executive director of our housing authority in Omaha. So I've had the opportunity to deal with this. And a couple things. One is every case is different. Every single person in poverty is different from the other person in poverty, and it's so difficult to categorize these matters. A young woman with a child or two children is in a different place than somebody that slipped into poverty because of the recession. Clearly the case. So and going back to the 1960s when many of these programs started, we had only a few programs. They were larger in a sense, but they had not been broken down into smaller component parts, and maybe a little easier to see where we were and what the spending was. We've sort of evolved from that into lots of little programs so that we have 80 programs or whatever it is. I know from my experience at the Housing Authority, the cliff effect is a huge issue, massive issue. The thousands of people that I tried to help in the Housing Authority who lose their housing subsidy when they receive a job, and then as opposed to at least maybe getting 90 days extra time so they could actually solidify their job employment status, and then all the other programs that are related to these individuals. That one of the biggest tragedies that went my years in the Housing Authority was just the loss of the self-sufficiency program. So on the housing side, when self-sufficiency funds were cut off, that was a massive disincentive and caused more people to remain in public housing when they should be out working. So every decision has a reaction, and every act has an act on the other side. So I'm really so my view seems to, from those experiences, is that number one, the comments made about data collection and data collection, and then also being able to rely on data to make decisions in a coordinated way is the most important thing we can do. Because if we have somebody come into, so let me ask this question. As you see all these various programs, we've talked about some of them, and this is an incredibly important committee meeting and subject for me because I spent a lot of my life working on this, and the biggest frustration was lack of data. The biggest frustration was not being able to take a look at the history of a particular recipient. Someone in the juvenile justice system, for example, and going back and trying to figure out why they got there. So I guess I've only given you a minute, but if you would just very briefly discuss where we are with data coordination and collaboration. These demonstration projects are important. Where do we go in that regard?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. For the demonstration projects, one certainly hopes and expects that a very good evaluation firm will be hired and that they will work with the states doing the demos, and that a condition of the demos will be real collection of good data. You have to have the data to evaluate. For SNAP as a whole, actually the data collection is much better than for a number of other federal programs. You compare Medicaid, for example, to SNAP. Medicaid caseload data is always a couple of years old. It's questionable. I will say SNAP, in terms of being current on expenditures, caseloads, annual breakouts of the characteristics of participants, is actually one of the best of the large programs on that front.
My time's up. I just wish there was one place we could go. So we had somebody in public housing to find out, what can we do to help them, get them a job, and get them what they need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Abraham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Knowing that a child can't learn if he's hungry, he or she. Mr. Aguilar's question that some veterans were having issues or problems getting some benefits. Of all the federal safety net programs that are out there, are there one or two that we need better coordination with the SNAP program to make it more efficient? This is a wonderful committee meeting, and we certainly want to serve those that need serving. but we also want to be efficient with our tax dollars as much as we can. So answer that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've thought about it a lot. You've heard us put together the issues of unemployment and SNAP. We could do the same about disability and TANF, but let me stay with unemployment because that's the problem facing so much of America today. European countries were famous for having almost infinite unemployment benefits, 5 years, 10 years, and so forth. You didn't have to look for a job and so forth. They've now, and I wish Mr. Ashford was here, because what they've done is they've gotten away from the cliff of benefits, and they have these step downs, so that after 1 year, your benefit goes down, your unemployment benefit goes down a certain amount. You're not thrown off. Then after another 6 months, your benefit goes down a little bit more. And this is a signal. And the research, I think, I'm sorry Bob's not here, he'll be right back. The research is, I think, pretty clear. When people see a deadline coming, it focuses their mind. Now, right now, it would be difficult to implement something like that because SNAP would have to be phased out the same way or phased in the same way. So my suggestion is, as you think about SNAP for higher income people, people who are working or can work, you connect it to the unemployment rules. And you make sure the two work in sync, because if SNAP is a countercyclical program, we ought to take that into consideration.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lujan Grisham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor, in your testimony, of course, you've indicated that you believe there's evidence to show that SNAP may, in fact, increase obesity in certain groups. And as a former health secretary, I certainly understand the importance of combating obesity. And, in fact, some startling statistics that are national, and I think as important are the startling statistics that are from my own home state. I'm going to start with those, where we have the hungriest children in the country. We have some of the highest poverty rates in the country. Childhood obesity has more than doubled in children and quadrupled in adolescents in the past 30 years. Obesity rates are significantly higher in low-income communities, which means states like New Mexico are hit even harder. Costs associated with obesity alone are about $147 billion. That's 2008. There are many estimates that get that closer to $300 billion, depending upon what other chronic issues you're identifying with obesity, which I would argue is relevant to the total cost. But I want to point out to some good news on that front. Now, the CDC recently showed that they had a 43% decrease in obesity in 2 to 5-year-olds. And let me tell you where that came from. It came from reducing the consumption of sweet beverages, improving nutritional standards and programs inside early childhood education, and providing physical activities, which are not requirements of the SNAP program, which are not being done by our school nutrition programs, which are not being done by states, particularly states that are poor. And so while I agree with you that we need to get our arms around, as policymakers, obesity and the challenges, I disagree that SNAP is that considerable force. And I want to tell you that I did the SNAP challenge, and I consider myself mom, raised 2 daughters, always been a public servant, got to be careful about what I can do and not do. And I can tell you that on $4.50 a day, I was pushed towards the kinds of simple carbohydrates that give you a full belly but aren't nutritionally sound and completely inappropriate. Rice, pasta, ramen. I could afford a couple of fresh fruits. I think it was an apple and maybe 2 bananas. I could not afford for a week's worth to buy fresh vegetables. So it is clear to me that with these food budgets that we are pushing families to purchase cheap, energy-dense foods that are filling as a way to maximize their calories per dollar and to, quite frankly, stave off hunger. Now, I've spoken to pediatricians and dietitians who agree that SNAP itself, having a food benefit, isn't the issue. It's about making sure that we're funding nutrition education and making sure that we're dealing with food deserts and making sure that we have access access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and quite frankly, making sure that the benefit matches that reality so that families can do that. We need to give them more options for food purchasing. We need to encourage marketers of fresh vegetables and fruit to open farmers markets in these communities that are only served by either a large grocery chain or a convenience market in rural and frontier communities. Given that, should the committee, Professor, look at increasing SNAP benefit levels so that families can, to our point, better afford adequate diets that include healthier foods?
Well, I made the point that I worry about people at the bottom. As incomes go up, the SNAP budget, is only a supplement to other monies available, and I would worry about people at the bottom. But I want to add something else because there's only a minute here. The other point you made, which I think is crucially important, you mentioned the food counseling in pre-K programs, and I don't remember if you said WIC.
I didn't say WIC, but I'm likely to maybe, I don't know, it's too early to tell, agree with your next statement. Let's see.
Okay. But WIC is largely, although there's a program for 3 to 5-year-olds, WIC is largely for the infants.
And their mothers.
So what you've just described are programs, right, that sort of don't continue for the lifetime of the recipients. So we could create a new program.
I'm going to reclaim my time. Are you maybe leaning towards increasing all of these programs? Because, in fact, I would absolutely agree with you, and that's a bit unfair.
I would stick more counseling into a SNAP program.
But all the studies indicate, in my last 16 seconds, sir, and I would love for you to come back to this committee, Mr. Chairman, and talk to us more about that in fact, it is the counseling and nutrition education along with sufficient resources to purchase those foods at home. It can't be a one-stop effort. And to be in a position to actually have those healthy lifestyles. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so very much.
Mr. Scott.
Yes. Thank you very much, Evan. First of all, the situation regarding employment and jobs, poverty, all of that has been structured into our economic, social policy over the last quarter century. And we've not been able to replace it. For example, millions of jobs that we once had 25 years ago have disappeared because of our terrible policy of shipping so many manufacturing jobs. These middle income, blue collar jobs have been shipped overseas, and we have lost. There has to be a struggle to get those manufacturing jobs back, open up manufacturing plants and start making it. We've become a service economy and not a making one. That is one area. The other one is our policy of sending so many of our young, eligible fathers to prison. Millions. Our prison population went from 300,000 in 1975 to over 2 million today. These are providers that are not there. And this is why we have so many single, female head of households. So when you look at everything that we have done, we've got to correct some of these things first. However, when we look at this situation and the hunger, we got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bath. Now, on the issues that seem to be permeating everybody's mind as waste, fraud, and abuse. But the facts tell us that SNAP abuse is lower than it's ever been. The most recent data show that the SNAP accuracy rate is 97%. And part of the remaining 3% was actually underpayments, which saved the government money. So my question here is that sometimes it's not getting the right answer that matters if we don't set up the right problem to get to that right answer. And I asked this question before. Where are examples of the fraud? Where are the examples of the abuse? Where are the areas in which we look inward to see where we cut or where we do this? And I can't find any answers on it. I want somebody to tell me where is the waste
where is the abuse? And where is the fraud in a program where the accuracy rate is said to be 97%, and the other 3% is largely due to underpayments?
You know, it's interesting, Congressman. A few years ago, the National Journal, one of the wonkier news magazines in town, looked at a whole range of federal programs, and they rated SNAP as one of the government's most successful programs.
Correct.
They noted two things: that for a program of its size and complexity, its error and fraud rates were very low, and that it is especially effective in responding promptly to increases in need, such as during recessions. But, we look at a lot of the issues. We're trying to improve the program and make it better. But this actually, I think, is one of the best-run programs we have. As I said at the beginning of my testimony, it has used business practice and information technology to come a long way. When I started working on the program, the error rate was 17%. The net loss is now 2%. It does much better in serving the working poor. Again, not that we can't make it better, but we should take account of the improvements that have been made and the degree of effectiveness that the program has. We live in a cynical time, and we tend to downgrade everything, but this program has really done enormous good for tens of millions of people over the last several decades.
Right.
I would just add one thing, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Your comment about the African Americans and other men who are in prison are about to come out. I think the number is close to 2 million.
Yeah.
My reading of the literature is these are some of the most employable men.
Absolutely.
And that the programs that work with them are much more successful than a lot of the other programs we talk about. So my temptation, wherever you get $1 billion, whether you shave it off SNAP or find it someplace else, one of the things we ought to do is fund some more of these prisoner reentry programs. And we're not doing a good job there, sir. We really aren't.
That's the direction we've got to look in. So many people look at the program and they want to just chop this thing up here while it's doing a great job. And the best way to bring down the cost of the SNAP program is to put people to work, get the jobs back from overseas, do the other things like the reentry program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say for the record, so it's clear, SNAP works. And Mr. Greenstein, I think you just made that point, but it is a well-run, efficiently run, effective program. And we should be proud of this program. And I think the narrative that we oftentimes hear does not reflect the reality. But I think it's important to state for the record that this program works. Secondly, I wish Mr. Rouser was still here because I had an answer that he could have given his constituent who went in a shopping line, didn't like the fact that the person in front of him was buying his groceries with food stamps, and wanted to know, how to respond to that. My response to that constituent would be, you should be very happy and thank God that you're not so poor that you qualify for this benefit. This notion that people want to be poor or like to be poor or prefer to be poor, I don't think reflects reality. I can assure you that someone who works and earns so little that they still are eligible for SNAP would prefer a job that pays a better wage so they can afford whatever food that they want. Let me also make the point, because listening to some of the comments in the committee here, I hope that we on this committee resist making this a debate about passing the buck to the states. States are cash-strapped too. I guess in a perfect world it would be nice if they could, at least for our own bottom line up here, if they could pick up everything that we do, but they're not going to do that. And on the issue of food, which I think we ought to consider as a right in this country, I think it is a federal obligation to make sure, to lead the effort to make sure that nobody in this country is hungry, and that in terms of our safety net, people have access to food. The other thing I'll point out is that SNAP is not a jobs program. It is a food program. And if we're going to demand, that people be enrolled in worker training programs and these programs and those programs, we ought to make sure the programs exist. Because, the rationale behind some of the governors who asked for these waivers were that, they didn't have enough programs to be able to accommodate all those who needed worker training. And I'm under no illusion that we in this Congress, by the way, all of a sudden got to get religion and start funding new programs or expanding programs, because all we seem to do is cut programs. But let me just ask for the record: do you believe that if the United States Congress passed and the President signed an increase in the federal minimum wage, that would reduce the number of people currently on SNAP in any way, shape, or form?
I don't think there's too much question. That it would reduce the number of people. It would also reduce the average benefit, because benefits relate to earnings.
Right.
I mean, the major issues affecting the size of the program are actually largely outside the control of this committee. If we had a 5% or a 4% unemployment rate, like we did in the late 90s, many fewer people would qualify for SNAP. If we had real wage growth at the bottom of the wage scale, which is an issue a lot broader than just the minimum wage, fewer people who work would need SNAP, and people who work and have SNAP would, on average, get lower benefits than they get today, because their wage level would be higher. But there is a direct relationship, and part of what's happened is, for the last number of years, we've been far from full employment, and we've had very substantial erosion of wages on the bottom ends of the wage scale. And those factors are among the significant reasons that the SNAP program has gotten larger. If we could get back to the kind of economy we had with fuller employment and stronger wages at the bottom, where when the economy grew, wages grew all across the income scale, you would have fewer people on SNAP, the average benefit of those on would be lower, and the costs would be lower.
Do you agree, Mr. Fisher?
I think I would worry about the number of jobs that existed. There's an argument, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that you raise the minimum wage too much and you lose jobs. I just parked at the University of Maryland yesterday. We fired 150, I think it is, could be more, could be less, parking lot attendants, and we put in machines. Not because the jobs went abroad, but because the machine was cheaper than paying someone to stand there and collect the money.
I'm not sure that's directly due to the minimum wage, but let me say I do think there's a problem when people work and they earn so little that they still qualify for these benefits. And if we can't have it both ways here. We can't be asking people to get off of SNAP and at the same time not providing them an alternative. I'll just say one final thing. I guess I can't. But
Gentlemen's time has expired. This is not the Rules Committee. It's the Ag Committee. Mr. Ashford for 5 minutes.
I know I'm actually talking twice here, and I apologize, Mr. Chairman, for everybody else is gone, so almost. No, I mean, we're very fortunate in Nebraska. We did pass the minimum wage. At a voter approval, 61% of Nebraskans, it's not exactly a liberal state, voted this time for a minimum wage increase, and it was not substantial. And I think your point about us making sure that it not be a significant wage increase or too much of a wage increase. I mean, ours is will go up to $9 in 2 years or whatever it is. But I think it will have a significant impact on our food stamp population. I just want to ask one last question because it's intriguing to me. Is if the database or the oversight or whatever in SNAP is as you suggest, Mr. Grandson, it's one of the better programs. I'm very interested in this. Can you then utilize the data that's collected in regards to SNAP? And I agree with Mr. McGovern that this is not an employment program. This is a food program. But there are agencies in localities that if we had the ability to understand what these people are going through, that data could be very helpful in increasing their ability to work or finding work, if it's that part of the population. And I realize SNAP is not just people that are just off work and need to find a job right away. So is that data robust enough to do that kind of interface?
We have a lot of good data on who goes on SNAP, how long do they stay, what are their characteristics, what are the precipitating factors, the most common is loss of a job, that leads them to go on. What we don't have at the present time are really good data on Here is the way to design an employment and training program for SNAP recipients to get the maximum bang for the buck in helping people move to employment. That's what we're hoping to learn from the demonstration project.
And I just think that's tremendous. And that's pretty new, isn't it? I mean, this demonstration project
hasn't even started yet.
I know this is new. No, I understand it hasn't started. We've gone through that hasn't started part, but it hasn't been tried that much either. I mean, this is something relatively new on the food stamp area. So this is a very good idea, and it seems to me, and that the information and that the Washington State program, for example, and I'm sure there are other states that have similar kinds of projects that can pick up on this, but it seems to me that that's pretty exciting, that if we can utilize a program like SNAP, not necessarily to design a program to get people off of food stamps, but to design a program that interfaces well with other programs and local agencies, whether it be housing or whatever it is, health care. One of the ironies in Nebraska, we did not pass Medicaid expansion. So what you have, which was unfortunate, so in my opinion, I mean, some of my colleagues in the legislature disagree with me. So, but basically, as you try to find enough work to get on an exchange so that you qualify for the exchange and get out of the donut hole, then you don't get food stamps, and then you don't get child care. I mean, so these every time there's an action, there's a reaction kind of things going on in government. It's not so much that we reduce the size of government, it's that we make government work better for our citizens. And it seems to me that partially could result in a reduction in the size of government. It obviously can do that. So I don't know, Mr. Bashoff.
Well, I just wanted to add a note of caution about these pilots. The Congress has been disappointed many times about the results of research, not because they didn't just like the results. The answer, some of the job training programs have taken 6, 7, and 8 years, right, to get our results. I don't think this committee would be very happy to look at the timeline of when these data are going to come out. And when they come out, there's going to be giant questions about the quality of the research and this and that. There'll be an important addition to our knowledge. But I've just seen us be too disappointed about the results of demonstrations, no matter how promising they look.
But maybe this one will be a better one, and we can put it on steroids and it'll get done faster. Sorry.
I'm also told that some states actually have built longitudinal databases that supplement the federal data with regard to SNAP participants. So in some individual states, I think we can get even richer data.
Gentleman yields back his time. Well, gentlemen, it looks like you've worn us completely out. I appreciate both of you being here this morning and the cordial way in which you address each other and the reaction to the questions. This is just the start of a long process. Ms. Walorski will have a hearing tomorrow at 1 o'clock, the first subcommittee hearing on this issue, and we intend to continue to flush these thoughts out, and look forward to your continued participation in our conversation. So thank you very much. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witness to any questions posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned. Thank you.